Hello and welcome to edition 11. I'm Paul Obitelli and it's great to be back here on the THA podcast, a show brought to you by Theo-Humanist Arts. Here at THA we bring you weekly shows where we will get stuck into many discussions and bring you all the best interviews we can get our hands on. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, history, art, fashions, music and much more. If you have any feedback you'd like to send our way, any ideas for the show, requests for potential guests, or something you yourself would like to share with us, you can do so by emailing info@thapodcast.com. That's info@thapodcast.com. Now for my usual disclaimer. We get a lot of people on the show with different opinions, different mindsets, different claims. We don't do this show to force you to believe anything. It's have a listen, do your own research, come to your own conclusions, as David and I do. We're not here to promote a hive mind, a single agenda. We have our favourite things, you have your favourite things, and we hopefully get a bit of a mixture here when we do them. Although I would advise you not to eat Kentucky Fried Chicken because junk food's not good for you. Anyway, on to this week's guest. This week we'll be interviewing Father Robert McTeigue, who is a Jesuit priest. He has a PhD in philosophy and he's a long-time serving lecturer at many Catholic universities in the US. So in a short while we'll be getting Robert on to have a chat with us. But before then, it's time for a surge from the dramaturge, Mr. David Parry.
Mr. Obitelli, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle do or die, a real-life nephew of my Uncle Sam. Actually, I'm not. But our guest today is, and he's a long-term friend of mine.
Ah, okay, yeah, and he's American. I forgot to add that part.
American of Irish descent, as far as I understand. A very interesting family background, so we've got lots to talk about, even on that basis.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of controversy surrounding groups like the Jesuits and other groups, particularly if you fish around on the internet. I do believe there's a hidden hand out there controlling things financially and manipulating people. A lot of conspiracies I back, but I'm undecided on who they are yet.
I think it just reflects largely what part of Europe or the world you're coming from. You know, are there conspiracies? Yes. Is everything a conspiracy? No. Sorry to be Mr. Skeptical, but hey, I am more than people realise on this show. Right. You know, there's something called the Orthodox Church, there's something called the Protestant Church, and it largely reflects geography as opposed to conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, I have exchanged a few emails with Robert, and he just warned me that he is obviously held accountable for what he says by the society because it's a responsibility. So obviously there's certain places that he'd have to tread carefully going into.
Yeah, he's a professional in a professional position, but you know we're looking at him as a writer as well as a priest, not just his position in the church.
Okay, well let's get to it. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Paul.
How are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm happy to be connected with you and David this afternoon.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Personally, I've not seen a lot of interviews from people in the Society of Jesus. Been fishing about for them myself, so it was good to get you onto this show.
Oh, very good. Well, Jesuits have always been at the forefront of the media since the time of the printing press.
Right. Well, to start with, maybe you could tell us how long you've been in the Society of Jesus.
Right.
And what got you going down that road.
Right. Well, I entered the Society of Jesus in the Maryland province in August 15th of 1990. And what drew me to the Society of Jesus was the example of St. Ignatius. At the age of 24, I remember telling a friend, I don't expect to be a happy person because I don't think there's a place in the world for someone like me. There's no place for my passion, my ideas, my hopes, and my aspirations. And then here comes St. Ignatius, who was a gallant man, a man of chivalry, a man of very great honor. And he said that there is a way of being a companion of Jesus, of distinguishing oneself in the service of Christ the King, and that one could give all. And that just swept me off my feet. And I kept meeting Jesuits who were happy and effective men, very much unlike the men leading lives of quiet desperation that I'd met in other fields. I was ordained a priest in June of '97, and I took my final vows in November of 2010. So I've been a Jesuit almost 24 years and a priest for almost 17.
Wow.
You don't have to be a priest to be a Jesuit then?
No, that's correct. As a matter of fact, usually the time of training from the time you enter the community to the time you become a priest is typically 11 years. So your first 2 years before you take first vows, you're called a novice. After you take your first vows, you're called a scholastic, and then eventually you're ordained a priest. But there's also a group of Jesuits called brothers who live the spirituality, live the mission, but don't study to be ordained priests, and they're called brothers.
Right. So say, for instance, if I wanted to become a Jesuit, what would the procedure be for someone like me?
Well, I joke with my friends that it would be easier for me to get married, get divorced, get an annulment, and join the CIA than to join the Society of Jesus. St. Ignatius in our constitutions is very, very exacting in the type of man he wants admitted to the Society of Jesus. Jesuits greatly respect not only divine prerogative, but human freedom. We're not used car salesmen. We want to make sure that there's a good match, that the decision to admit the man to the Society of Jesus would be something that's the fruit of discernment. So you would need a spiritual director, you would need to get to know other Jesuits, visit communities, and so on. And if you say, I think God might be calling me to this life, you would have to make an 8-day retreat under the direction of a Jesuit. And if the discernment was confirmed that now is the time to make an application, you would start by undergoing every physical and psychological test known to man, very many letters of references, several interviews. You'd have to write a 15-page spiritual autobiography. All of that is submitted to the provincial council, who makes the recommendation, and finally the provincial superior would make a decision. And that's just to get into the front door.
Right. So it's quite difficult then.
The analogy that I use, because some people say, well, what's the difference between, say, your diocesan parish priest and a member of religious order? And I said, well, if you use a law enforcement metaphor, you can think of your diocesan bishop, in American terms, we call it a county sheriff, and your local parish priest would be the local deputy. The religious orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Benedictines, the Jesuits, we're more like the military, distinctive training, history, uniform, mission, etc. And the Society of Jesus is kind of the special forces of the church. When you have extreme missions that require extreme training, having one or two men go off onto a dangerous mission, then you would call upon the Jesuits. As a matter of fact, just a few years ago, I think it was the Navy War College, someone produced a master's thesis on Jesuit missionaries as the ideal model for the Special Forces operator. Also, if you're a Jesuit saint or blessed, there's about a 97% likelihood that you're also a martyr. So it's for when something liminal, when something dangerous, when something risky, when something unprecedented needs to be done, that's what you'd call upon a Jesuit for. That's the history of our charism.
Does any, things like exorcisms, do you see any of that stuff go on?
Well, any priest would be very, very discreet about that sort of thing. What we would call a solemn exorcism would only be done by a priest who's been given specific permission by the local bishop. And because of the very sensitive nature of the material, and honestly the way that Hollywood sensationalizes it, we don't talk a very great deal about that sort of thing. Now, of course, we're very careful these days. We would make sure that a person had undergone a great deal of psychological counseling, physical evaluations, and so on. We're not a superstitious lot, and we don't see the boogeyman under every rock. real honest to goodness, full blown possession where you would need to go to the bishop for permission for a solemn exorcism is actually really quite rare.
Yeah. But it's something you believe in that goes on out there. Then it's something.
Sure. It's certainly something that's real.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. I think ordinarily people need to be prayed with, to receive blessings, and Jesuit spirituality is very agonistic. It's very martial. We engage what we would call spiritual warfare. We're aware of the human soul being contested for, and a great deal of our spirituality focuses on what St. Ignatius would call the discernment of spirit. So if you have an inclination to do something or refrain from something, is that from my own human heart? Is it a prompting of the good spirit? Is it a prompting of the evil spirit? So learning the patterns of light and dark in the life of an ordinary person is something that a Jesuit very, very frequently, almost on a daily basis, would be engaged in, where most Jesuits in a very long life of service would have nothing to do with an exorcism.
Right, yeah. Obviously, there's if you look on the internet and which is pretty rampant nowadays, and there's conspiracies flying all over the place. Be it conspiracies about the Jews, conspiracies about the Jesuits, conspiracies about this lot, that lot, the Freemasons. And obviously, picking up people like Jordan Maxwell. I'm not sure if you've read any of his stuff.
Don't forget the Trilateral Commission and the Lizard People.
Well, that's all in there as well. The David Icke and stuff. When you hear this stuff, how does it sit with you? What do you think?
I have to smile. There's a rule of thumb that if you like to hate Catholics, you love to hate Jesuits. Right. And historically, we've always been the team to beat in that regard. There's a lot of hysteria. There's a lot of thoughtlessness. I mean, some of it is amusing because it's so obviously silly. The elements that are more insidious are the ones that have maybe a grain of truth that people exaggerate that seems plausible to others. And then, of course, are just outright fabrications as well. But the idea that somehow the Jews and the Jesuits run the world, I want to say, if only.
So, I mean, what's your general view on? I mean, the New World Order. Do you see that going on, or do you see the whole thing as a conspiracy?
My take on things is, one can be sinister without being nefarious. I don't know that the International Monetary Fund, for example, has dark rituals, but I strongly suspect they're up to no good more often than not. That's how I would look at it. And I'm pretty sure that the Society of Jesus doesn't have anything to do with them. I'm also not a fan of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. I don't think they have Masonic rituals either, but I know they're up to tremendous mischief.
Okay, well, that sort of brings me on. What do you think of things? What are your views on things like Freemasonry and sort of groups like that?
Well, the Catholic Church has always has a strongly negative attitude towards Catholics joining secret societies. So a Catholic in good standing could not join a Masonic temple,
right?
For example, and historically, the Masons have been inimical to the Catholic Church. And again, the old saw that if you like to hate Catholics, you love to hate Jesuits. At St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit school in St. Louis, Missouri, for example, there is an enormous Masonic temple built right across the street from St. Louis University, pretty much to put a thumb in the eye of the Jesuits. And of course, now the building stands empty as a white elephant. And I think some years ago, the university tried to buy it. I don't know if it ever did, but I think it would be a delicious irony if the university ever did. Okay,
so what you're saying is there are a few groups out there that may be moving towards something along the lines of New World Order, and you guys oppose it as well, basically.
Right. I mean, Jesuits, of course, very greatly respect human freedom and human dignity for all human beings, and we would be on the watch for religionists, secularists, or dictators of any stripe who would want to act in a way that's contrary to human dignity and to human freedom.
Right. Okay, David, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Again, we're in difficult territory, as sort of we were with Jim. I mean, not only do I know Robert very well, but he's a man of complexity, and it's hard to know where to begin with him. And this is Passion Sunday, and I'm sure he's been preaching, so he's probably quite tired at the minute. I want to take us away from the supernatural for a moment.
Right.
Okay.
You studied under the demigod of philosophy, Paul Weiss.
Yes, I did.
An atheist Jew, of course.
Agnostic. He described himself as an agnostic Jewish metaphysician.
Well, Robert, I mean, it's such an intriguing relationship. I always got the impression that you were the heir apparent in that particular wonderful view of aesthetics and philosophy. I mean, would you care to tell us a bit about not only your relationship, but what happened, your involvement with that sort of view?
Sure. Paul Weiss was my mentor when I was in graduate studies in philosophy at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And I would tell my students that if I believed in reincarnation, and of course as a Catholic I don't, but if I did, I would insist that Paul Weiss was the reincarnation of Socrates. He had a platonically erotic passion for the truth, a relentless desire to know. He was a very, very self-effacing man, as ready to be correct as he was to be corrected. He started off as a very, very poor boy in a Jewish neighborhood in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, born in 1901, went to City College, got a scholarship to Harvard, and was studying under Alfred North Whitehead, and began his career as a symbolic logician. And he said in Harvard in the 20s, here's how philosophy was taught. In the beginning, there was Plato, then there was Aristotle, then absolutely nothing happened for centuries. And then ex nihilo emerged Descartes. And then, surpassing strange, the great French Catholic scholar Etienne Gilson visited for a few years to teach at Harvard. And Weiss admired Gilson. He said he was a master of the sources, knew the original languages, knew all the footnotes forward and backwards, and was absolutely fearless and would take on any comer at any time on any topic. And was utterly unapologetic for his positions. And it was reading the medievals with Gilson, but especially reading Bonaventure, that opened the transcendent to Paul Weiss. And he gave up a very promising career as a symbolic logician to begin a study of metaphysics at a time when no one really outside of the Catholic intellectual ghetto would give metaphysics the time of day. But in the U.S., it was Dewey and the Pragmatists. It was the Vienna Circle on the continent. And then here's Paul Weiss. His first book had the immodest title of Reality. He taught at Bryn Mawr, eventually became Sterling Professor at Yale. And when the great Jesuit John Courtney Murray was a visiting scholar at Yale, and just as Weiss was subject to anti-Semitic bigotry, Father Murray was subject to anti-Catholic bigotry. And Paul had a special sympathy for the outsider, and he befriended Father Murray. Eventually, Dr. Weiss moved to the Catholic University of America. Along the way, he founded the Metaphysical Society of America, the Review of Metaphysics, which he edited for decades, wrote hundreds of articles, dozens and dozens of books, and was not content on being just an exegete. He did not want to be what he called the ist of an ism. And he complained that philosophers let theories get in the way of what they and everyone else know. So he advocated what I call real philosophy for real people. He was an original thinker. He had an ontology, he had an epistemology, he had an aesthetics, a politics, a relentlessly active mind. I started to take courses with him when I began the doctoral program at Catholic University, having already earned my BA and my MA there. And it was electrifying. It was thrilling. He wasn't someone he would do more than just offer you the opportunity to be a scholar. It was an opportunity to be a philosopher. I read his book called The God We Seek and was just bowled over that this man wrote with such passion and eloquence and profound insight about religious phenomena. And there were people who would read that work and say, Paul, how is it possible that you could write this way when you claim that you don't pray, you don't believe, and have never had a religious experience? His claim was this, that the insight he had into religious phenomena, religious life, was afforded by his perspective as a philosopher, but the price of that perspective was the distance from the reality. And he said that what I was trying to do in my doctoral dissertation was to do both, to be both the mystic and the metaphysician at the same time. So my dissertation was called Exploring Grounds of Commitment, an Examination of Reason. What I wanted to do was look at the metaphysics underlying commitment to a transcendent good. I wanted to examine faith and reason and their tension as a test case for understanding commitment. And I did a close reading of Augustine, Aquinas, Whitehead, Gilson, and then ultimately Weiss himself, and then went off in my own direction. We became very great friends, very much father and son relationship. He wrote a letter of reference for me when I applied to this Society of Jesus. He hosted the party when I graduated with my PhD. And I was just devastated when he died on July 5th, 2002, at the age of 101. I still miss him terribly. And no one ever really set me free and set me on fire in terms of the life of the mind the way that Paul Weiss did. But here's the interesting thing. He had a passion and a fascination with Catholic theology. And he said, I can't believe, I don't understand how someone could be a lukewarm Catholic. He said, if you have faith, you have the opportunity to participate in a miracle. How could you not give yourself to that? So I would visit him for the weekend, and I'd be cooking dinner, and on the table we would have the Bible and the Catechism and the Summa and Ronner's Dictionary and von Balthasar, and we would just eat and drink and laugh and talk until the wee hours, and we would just do that for days at a time. And the Society of Jesus had such an appreciation of his role in my life that my first 2 summers as a novice, my summer assignment was to live in Washington and visit with him every day and talk philosophy. That's how much the Society of Jesus values the life of the mind. When my novice master came to visit and we talked for an afternoon, as we walked home, I said, well, Father, what do you think? He said, well, watching the two of you talk was like watching a performance of Handel's Messiah directed by Handel.
Incredible. I mean, let me add a sort of lighter tone here for a moment, because you compared him to Yoda in Star Wars.
Right.
Compared him to a Jedi, and we both chuckled because it was sort of quite an obvious correspondence.
Sure.
We chuckled at that in the past. The one that I remember most from this man of great learning was that you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it was like being taught in the early days by a sort of Jewish butcher who was trying to sell you something. Do you remember the story?
Oh, let me see if I can recall.
Because it was so good.
Oh yes, I remember now.
It brought the man's character.
Part of it was he was hard of hearing, and it went like this. You know, we'd be in a seminar, and he'd say, "Ontological. That's a big word. Do you know what it means? You're trying to tell me from ontological? All right, you have the floor. Go ahead. Tell me what ontological means." And he put his head down, and he'd wait a minute, and then he would turn to me and he said, "I don't hear anything. Has he said anything yet?" And I said, the analogy was, what do you mean that's not lean corned beef? You wouldn't know lean corned beef if it bit you on the ass. Give it to me. I'm not even going to sell it to you now. So he taught philosophy as a full contact sport.
Yeah.
And because he was hard of hearing, you had to yell everything. So imagine the defense of my dissertation. Yeah. And usually, I mean, they're very, very polite. And it's kind of a ritualistic hazing ritual. And what's supposed to happen is your director does kind of slow-pitched softball to let you show off your stuff, and then the other members of the committee rough you up so that you don't appear too uppity, and then they grudgingly let you in because they figure, well, we let you this far, it would embarrass us, we didn't let you in all the way.
Yeah.
So this is where the image of the Jedi comes in. He walked with two canes, and he picked up one cane, and he started waving it around the room, and he pushed my manuscript aside and said, "This manuscript is yesterday's news. On Tuesday, I asked you what underlies being. You didn't tell me. Here it is Wednesday. You still haven't told us what underlies being. What the hell are you trying to hide?" Now, for us, that was just an ordinary opening gambit in a polite conversation. Everyone else was shocked, and I shoved the manuscript back, and I said, "You want me to apologize because reality extends beyond the reach of the tools you've given me. I can't apologize for that. I won't." And we went back and forth, swinging and yelling at each other for half an hour. And then he said, "Okay, I'm satisfied." And he put his cane away, almost as if he flicked off his lightsaber.
Yeah.
And as we were driving home afterwards, he said, "You understand why I had to do it that way? Because you were commenting on some of my unpublished material. I had to make sure that they saw that I wasn't giving you a free ride." And I said, "Well, in hindsight, I see that. I would have liked a heads up."
Yeah.
I also felt like I was under tutelage of a great kung fu master. After the doctoral graduation ceremony, we had a reception at his flat, and he sat in this kind of Kennedy-esque rocking chair, and he said, "Well, it seems to me that maybe the young doctor got his degree too easily, so we'll all start asking him hard questions. I'll start." And we went back and forth, and then my father pulled me aside and said, "You guys were sparring, weren't you?"
Yeah.
I said, "Yes, that's what we do." And what a thrill to have a real living philosopher who said ultimately he did not want followers. He said the best way to portray him was to have a Weiss school producing Weissians. He said he wanted colleagues who would eventually go beyond him.
Robert, I need to take that a bit further, if you don't mind. I mean, he was a man of strong views. I mean, he had strong views of the philosopher Merleau-Ponty. I remember a story there. And he also, at the risk of stepping on toes, put you in a slightly awkward position with the philosopher Richard Rorty at one point.
Oh, right. Well, Richard Rorty was a student of Weiss's at Yale, which I think was not a fact that Weiss was very proud of. The way that Weiss put it, he says, "I could kick him." The way that he put it. At that time, his son Jonathan, who's still alive, by the way, was in his 70s, living in Manhattan, a graduate of Yale Law School, and who distinguished himself by not trying to get rich. Worked in labor law and eventually in defense of the elderly. And when Dr. Weiss turned, I think it was 95, we had a party as a fundraiser because Johnny at the time was the director of legal services for the elderly in New York. And we're having a kind of a conversation in a playful but agonistic way. And Richard Rorty was there, and Dr. Weiss had said, "I've committed my life to the discovery of first principles." And his son Johnny, being the consummate nudge, said, "Well, Richard Rorty said there aren't such things." And Dr. Weiss immediately pivoted and said, "Well, I'd have to ask him, why the hell not? Why does he say that?" And Rorty just backed down and tried to laugh it off and said, "Oh, just a hunch, ha-ha," and stepped back. And in Weiss's view, backing down from a hard question was the unforgivable sin. If you were going to make a claim and not back it up when the questions came, that was the sin against the Holy Spirit.
Right. I mean, he wanted you to sort of tackle him at one point, I seem to remember.
No, I actually, it was Johnny. I talked to Johnny later, and and I said, "Johnny, you kind of put Richard on the spot," and he just said, "Screw him, I'm with my father." And then, Johnny and Paul Weiss both said, he says, "You really should have gone after Richard Rorty." And I said, "Well, it was a birthday party, actually. I didn't think it was my place for a philosophical mugging. We had kind of a laugh."
Well, I mean, let me take you back to the fact he didn't suffer fools gladly, or indeed sometimes major colleagues. I seem to recall that he had very strong views on Merleau-Ponty.
I have to confess, I don't have a recollection. I do know that Oh, who was one of the founding fathers of process philosophy? He was also a student of Hartshorne, Charles Hartshorne. Oh my goodness, the way they clashed. The undergraduate student association at Catholic University invited Hartshorne to speak. Now,
Yeah.
Weiss took ontology and substance philosophy very, very seriously,
Mm.
and he also thought that what Hartshorne did with process philosophy was not a genuine development from their mutual mentor, Whitehead. And
Mm.
so they wrote about and against each other for decades.
Yeah.
So here we are at this polite reception afterwards, and Weiss goes immediately after Hartshorne, who was a very sweet patrician New Englander.
Right.
And he said to Paul Weiss, and again, there's a certain freedom that comes when you know someone 65 years, you can say such things. And he said, Paul, you once wrote that my most distinctive feature was my kindness, and you did not think that philosophy was necessarily best served by that. He said, Paul, I think your most distinctive feature is your combativeness, and I don't think that philosophy is necessarily well served by that. And so they went back and forth and back and forth, and finally Hartshorne got indignant and said, Paul, I'm used to being treated by colleagues. You're speaking to me as if I were a student. And he goes, all right, Charles, pretend I'm one of your colleagues. Then what would you say to me? And Hartshorne sputtered. And then Weiss turned to me. And who am I? I'm 26, 27 years old. I don't have my doctorate yet. And he says, I'm not getting through to him. You tell him what I mean. Let me tell you one of my favorite stories about Paul Weiss. This is when I was just started working with him, and he was only 85, and we were going to take him out to dinner.
Yeah.
And we, because they said, well, he's 85, he's not going to be around much longer, which turned out not to be true. And we're at a swanky Washington restaurant, and a Jesuit, Father Robert Spitzer, whom I commend to you, and his very significant work, who was also a doctoral student with Weiss at a time, offered an eloquent champagne toast. And then Weiss sat back in his chair and he said, I want you guys to each ask me a hard question, something you think I can't answer. We'll start with you, McTeigue. Go ahead. And I nearly passed champagne through my nose. Yeah. And I said, well, Dr. Weiss, you told me once that you had not found a persuasive argument for or against the immortality of the soul. I said, if it were completely up to you, as Mark Twain might say, if you had your druthers, which would it be, death as final or immortality? And he said, it's a matter of complete indifference to me. And I said, I'm sorry, I find that difficult to countenance. I said, what is it about immortality that doesn't appeal to you? And he said, my ego's not that big. Who the hell am I? I'm this rotten bastard who thinks bad thoughts. Why the hell should I be kept around? And I said, but doesn't that put all of the onus on you? Yeah. Can't you imagine an agency freely, dare I say, graciously, offering to maintain you in existence independent of your merits? Now, I didn't know some of his tricks at the time, and I also didn't know him that well to know that he was very uncomfortable with the idea of receiving something that he didn't deserve or that where he couldn't reciprocate. And he said, hey, that's a really good question. I think the other guys didn't hear you. Hey, listen to McTeige's question. And he just kind of dodged it that way. But it was indicative of his like I said, he was so wanted to only have what he had earned or deserved. It pained him not to be able to reciprocate. When he was a very poor student at Yale, Whitehead's wife made make work for him to pay him rather than giving him a handout outright, which would have humiliated him. And it was only many years later that he realized the act of charity that she had performed for him, and it was anguish for him that he could never reciprocate. And I said, well, look, Dr. Weiss, I can never be for you what you were for me. That's not possible. I said, however, what I can do is honor your example by trying to be for my students what you've been for me, to give you tools, to give you fire, and to set you free. And he said, yes, that would be the best possible way to honor my effort. So that's what I've tried to do in all my teaching.
After all, you grew up in Newark, New Jersey.
Yes.
You're a poet. You're a short story writer. You're a man of great literary skills. How has that helped your ministry? How has the creativity sort of affected your theology or you as a person? If it has, maybe it hasn't.
Oh no, I think it certainly has. It's I'll see if I can tell through an illustration. I taught at a seminary, and someone had asked me, "How long does it take you to prepare a homily?" And I said, "Always the same amount of time, no matter what the homily or the occasion. Always my whole life." And I think that we're formed by the events of our lives, everything we've read, the people that we encounter, and so on. And all of that is grist for the mill. That was one of the insights of St. Ignatius Loyola. That's why we have Jesuits who, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, astronomers, opera writers, architects, anything you can think, all of it can be used for the greater glory of God. One of my great passions is about preaching and about I keep looking for the proper word, but now I'm using the revivification, if not the resuscitation, of Catholic liturgical preaching. And I found that the ability to tell a story, the ability to inject poetry, to have substance injected into a homily rather than fluff, drawing upon great theological and philosophical sources, and yet doing it in a way that's accessible has been very fruitful. I've also found that if you can draw people into a narrative, if you can present them with a situation, hypothetical or real, that cries out for a resolution beyond the range of their present resources, then you can get them to turn to you and say, well, what else do you have in your sack? And as Jesus said, like a provident steward, bringing out the old and the new. So there's an opportunity for that. Presently, I'm on the verge of putting together an anthology of my homilies that should be done in a matter of months. And it's a collection of my preaching as well as some essays on preaching. And then and that's going to be called I Have Someone to Tell You, a Jesuit heralds the gospel. Shortly after that will be, if you will, a compilation of thoughts for each day, kind of McTeighian aphorisms throughout the liturgical season, and that will be called A Well-Seasoned Faith, a year's daily prayer from a Jesuit's daily pulpit. And that should come out this summer. And by the end of the summer, I hope to finish a book that is well overdue, which I will dedicate to Paul Weiss, of course, called Real Philosophy for Real People, a sketch of reality, humanity, and morality. And it's about the intersection of metaphysics, anthropology, and ethics, which is something that's been honed through years of teaching. And once those more technical works are out of the way, I want to focus my attention more on poetry and haiku and continue writing short stories. And I have some ideas for some novels. I'm torn. On the one hand, I've been talking for years, only partly in jest, about a series of Jesuit supernatural thrillers, what my sister calls The Exorcist meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer, featuring a Jesuit philosopher and his younger sister who is a kung fu master. And of course, this is where art imitates life, because I am a philosophy professor and my sister is a kung fu master. She studies Southern Shaolin Hanga Kung Fu. I've also been thinking of moving into the fantasy genre, something set in an alternative medieval Ireland where the main characters are poets, bards, philosophers, and psychics. And that would be a way of getting people to eat their broccoli without letting them know that it's broccoli. What I want to do there is do a series of novels introducing the Jesuit themes of spiritual warfare, casting it as the servants of the king versus the servants of the dragon. So it would be telling in kind of medieval fantasy narrative form the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius.
You and I share a deep concern about what's happening to Western society, Western culture, Western civilization. We're both sometimes in very parallel paths, sometimes in very close proximity to each other, looking at those resources that have either been abandoned or left behind or maybe even forgotten. Do you think you're making any headway in discovering those resources, Robert, and how they could be used?
Yes, I have. I'm glad you asked. I'm teaching a course this semester called Classical Rhetoric and Public Speaking. And I've happened upon an author whom I believe is British, Stratford Caldecott. The name like that, he needs to be British. But he's done a book called Beauty in the Word, which is about the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then another book called Beauty for Truth's Sake, which is about the medieval quadrivium. And I have found him to be enormously helpful in bringing together the classical stream from Greece and Rome and relating the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic to a Trinitarian structure. Also, I've dug back a little bit. An author I want to recommend to you, a classicist who died about 10 or 15 years ago named John Senior, did a book in 1978 called The Death of Christian Culture, recently republished by his son. You can find it on Kindle at Amazon. And I've never seen anyone so incisive and prescient in both his analysis of the root of the rot and then also a prediction as to what might be coming. In 1983, he did a book called The Restoration of Christian Culture, which is really beautiful and inspiring. And then more recently, John Horvat, Horvat, has published, he comes from an organization called Tradition, Family, and Property, I believe. And he has a book called Return to Order. And what I think he's doing is he's recognizing that I would say really since the time of Descartes and the emergence of naturalism, divorced even from deism, there's been a progressive evacuation of the personal from both the divine and the human, which leads me to Jesuit Henri de Lubac's, I think, very astute observation that secular humanism is humanism. And I think the very great, richest resources from Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome can be brought together in a contemporary context. And one area where I found this very fascinating is there's a movement of young Catholics in the United States, I believe called Juventum, and they put an emphasis on a reappreciation of traditional Catholic liturgy, the traditional Latin Mass, which Pope Benedict XVI called the Mass in the extraordinary form, what might be known in more common parlance called the Tridentine Mass, or the Mass of Pope Pius V.
Could you repeat what it was called? Because you just cut off then a little bit.
Oh, sure. It's sometimes called the traditional Latin Mass.
Right.
Or what would be called, what Pope Benedict XVI would call the Mass in the extraordinary form. In other words, the Mass prior to Vatican Council II in the mid-1960s. And what some people might know as the Tridentine Mass or the Mass of Pope Pius V. And here's what I think is very interesting, because remember, these are young people. They're not engaging in nostalgia from their youth. But what they're discovering is that there is a contemplative aspect in worship. There is a power in reappropriating ritual and gesture and symbol and silence and submitting yourself to the power of ritual that's actually freeing and enlivening and is actually quite countercultural. So this has been very refreshing for me. As a matter of fact, just this morning, I offered my first Sunday public Mass in the extraordinary form for the first time.
Oh, gosh. Oh, I wish I'd seen that. Robert, let me ask one thing. I know I have the honor to know your sister as Kung Su, of course.
Right.
Fine-looking young lady and a very, very skilled practitioner of the martial arts. I know she wants to ask questions about her work, her calling. There's one last thing I want to say. I mean, I seem to remember years back, we were talking about the movies The Exorcist.
Right.
And the conversation turned to the fact it had been a book and it had actually been based on a genuine phenomena, a genuine case.
Right. And yes, in St. Louis.
Yeah, I mean, I seem to recall you saying that either one of your teachers or one of your counselors had been involved in the actual real case. Was that correct?
Oh, okay. Well, William Peter Blatty was the author of the novel and then wrote the screenplay. And he was a friend, and I think may have been spiritual directee of the late Father Thomas King, a very distinguished theologian who had a very long career at Georgetown University. And when I was trying to figure out what next with my life after graduation, etc., Father Robert Spitzer said, I want to introduce you to Father King. He's the resident mystic of Georgetown. And I got to know him, an extraordinarily holy and wise man who introduced me to St. Ignatius and the spiritual exercises and was the first to suggest I had a Jesuit vocation. But he asked Vlad, he says, why are you writing this book? Why are you doing this work? And this is, mind you, this is back in the 60s. He said, people have stopped taking evil seriously. And if you don't take evil seriously, you can't take God seriously. And that's why he wrote it. Many years later, when I was a young scholastic teaching in St. Louis, I'd met an older priest who has since gone to God, and he was the young scholastic who was assisting in the case that eventually was depicted in the movie. And he was a young man at the time. So I mean, there something really did happen in St. Louis, and I was able to talk briefly and discreetly with someone who attended it all as a young man.
Robert, I could talk to you for hours, but we can spend hours talking anyway.
Sure.
Young Paul, anything else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was particularly interested in your views on ritual and stuff. Do you view a lot of what you do within Christianity? Do you view that as ritual, or? Oh,
yes, certainly. I mean, especially as a Catholic, we have a tremendous emphasis on the sacramental system. David may have heard this story already, but he and I studied theology together at Heythrop College, in London, and I was taking a course. I think it may have been taught by Theo Davies, who was a Passionist priest, and it was on ritual and sacrament. And I remember there was a number of very senior-ranking clergy from other denominations attending a few lectures. And Father Davies asked me to give a presentation on performative utterance. And I spoke for about 15 minutes about that. And the senior Anglican divine turned to me in wonder and amazement, and he said, "You mean the sacraments actually do something?" Now, I ask my students, what are the roots of that question? Well, that question is only meaningful on the condition that you only have social categories.
Yeah.
In other words, baptism is a ritual of initiation, just like joining a Masonic lodge or a fraternity or a football club. But you need to have the metaphysics. You need to have an ontological grounding to talk about the sacraments actually doing something.
Okay, well, I'm not too sure if it's the case with every Christian outlook or philosophy out there, but generally any ritual or praying that isn't directed towards Jesus Christ is viewed as channeling the wrong forces and such. Would you regard ritual as a power of its own and something separate? For example, if I'd done a ritual that didn't involve Jesus Christ, would you see that as damaging or wrong?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by ritual. I mean, there's a way in which the way you pour a pint of Guinness properly can be considered a ritual, or the way that you set the table before you have breakfast with your gran can be a ritual. So I would need to know more concretely what you mean and intend by the word ritual.
Well, I'm not sure if I was to use the word magic, if that would be right. But for what you do within a church ritually,
right?
Is that sacred to the church only, or can ritual be done elsewhere?
Well, here's what I would say. I mean, especially in talking to Christians, and especially Catholic Christians, we in the church take the first commandment very seriously.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why it's the first. And I draw the analogy. I said, when you fire up your computer and you go online, you have your firewall and you have your antivirus software running, and you don't hand your credit card number over to strangers.
Yeah.
Because you never know what you're contacting or what you're going to bring into your system. So I would say we have to be careful not to be spiritually promiscuous for fear of what we might be contacting.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Right.
Okay. Well, David, have you got anything to add?
Well, I think that's the perfect lead into my last observation. I mean, Robert, you take the presence of the supernatural in modern life, as indeed I do, very, very seriously.
Yes, of course.
Do you think it directly affects your work, not only as a priest, which is primary, but as an individual person? And do you think maybe, because it's just something that's been on my mind recently, that the newer generation is under attack more than we were? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, well, in my rhetoric class, when we talk about the classic clashes between rhetoric and sophistry, and I said anyone who says, oh, that's just rhetoric, is really saying, look at me, I haven't had a classical education and I haven't read Aristotle. Rhetoric is a very, very noble thing. But now when we join rhetoric to the power of electronic media, we move from the possibility of sophistry to the very real danger of propaganda. And now add something really insidious, say pornography.
Yeah.
And that can change you not only spiritually, but even at the neurochemical level. I mean, that's documented.
Yeah.
Better documented than global warming, I hasten to add, contrary to what they tell us at East Anglia University. But look, so here's the problem. We have a lot of kids growing up who both in terms of their rational, strictly logical education, don't know how to do their homework, so they don't know how to resist the blandishments of advertisement or the lies of propaganda, and also lack the spiritual resources to resist the blandishment of advertisements and the lies of propaganda. And I think that we're making use of the internet right now. I have my Android Razr at my right hand, but we haven't been immersed and pickled in it. We can imagine a life apart from it, a way that very many contemporary, say, American university students can't. I mean, when I tell students, well, the season of Lent is coming, you're looking for penitential practice, why don't you fast from Facebook during Lent? It usually induces panic. It's considered excessive.
Yeah.
So my concern, we have a culture and an educational system and an impoverished spiritual network that is leaving our young people bereft of resource in terms of both reason and of spirit for resisting the lies they're being fed.
Paul, I think that leads into conspiracy territory. Any last thoughts from you, my friend?
I've got to think now. No, I mean, I think we've covered quite a lot there.
Well, I mean, Robert, we need back very, very clearly.
Yeah.
We could talk about all of these subjects individually for hours on end.
Sure.
It's a treasure trove of information.
Yeah.
And a thoroughly clear-sighted priest, a rare commodity these days.
One interesting thing.
You need to know where to look.
One interesting thing I'd like to bring up is not long ago there was the 2012 Mayan calendar craze. The 2012 this is going on, and there's a lot of branches that come off that, a lot of subjects that come off that. What are your views on that, the Mayan calendar and that philosophy?
Well, I'm reminded of a book written by an evangelical in the early 90s, and it was called Soothsayers of the Second Advent. And he was an evangelical, embarrassed by many of his fellow evangelicals, because he said, look, in 1988, the most popular book in the evangelical world in the U.S. was called 88 Reasons Why He's Coming Back in 88. And it was only outsold by the book the following year called 89 Reasons Why He's Coming Back in 89. He said, presumably the 89th reason was because he didn't come back in 88.
Right.
I'm very, very skeptical about people reading whatever form of tea leaves they think are available to them to note the hour and the day. No one knows when death is coming for any of us or when Christ is returning in glory. So the best thing to do is to go about your business, do the duties of your state in life, and be ready that way.
Yeah.
I'm very, very wary of anyone claiming to have a particular timetable. I'm really skittish about that.
Okay.
Evil is at work in the world. God is at work in the world, and I say that without being a Manichaean. The Christ is constantly calling. What I want to do is help people hear that call and respond together. What God does with that in the future, that's up to God. But I know what God asks of me here and now.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that kind of ties it up. Any last things you want to say, David?
Well, no, I noticed you managed to hold back your questions about the Illuminati. All I can say is I'm so relieved.
well, we kind of covered it in the before with the Freemasons and the
They are there. They get enough press anyway, and you know what I think about most of it. No, I think we've rounded it off for today. Robert, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to be on and sharing the true life of an active and engaging mind with us. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been a very happy privilege for me, David. You know, I'm grateful for our friendship. I mean, this fall it'll be 20 years that we know each other.
My God.
So thanks be to God for that. I hope in God's providence we can visit sometime soon. Paul, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope we can do business again.
Yeah, no, it'll be good to get you back on, and maybe we could chat direct like one particular subject and really go into it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And we were talking about a lot of my favorite topics today. So
right, okay.
Thank you so very much, gentlemen.
Okay, bye-bye.
Adieu, Robert. Adieu.
Well, that's another wrap then.
Another fine interview for the podcast.
Yeah, that's another one for the pile. Yeah, it was interesting. I'm convinced that there's you can't categorize everyone in the same pile. You know, he can only speak from his own experiences and people he knows, and that's fair enough. And I felt he was quite genuine in what he was saying.
Yeah.
But you know, there's always it only takes a few, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know. I just wish we'd put the locus of blame where it belongs. On the big banking families and international finance, and not this nonsense where nobody's got any power and they're not really doing it.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's one thing I think where there is evidence we can point the finger at the bankers, because we can all see what they're doing in broad daylight.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and nobody's bothered about the real cause of concern. That's
Well, it seems people are content on they point at the bankers, but they're more interested rather than just pointing at the bankers. They basically want to point at the bankers and say, "Oh, the bankers are the Jews, or the bankers are the Jesuits, or the bankers are this lot." It's like, who cares who they are? The fact is, they're there. We can see what they're doing. We can see that agenda in broad daylight. But,
I care who they are, and we know who they are, and it's not to do with ethnicity, and it's not to do with Freemasons. It's to do with money.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the Baron de Rothschild and the Rockefellers and all the rest of them will know who I mean.
I say money and control. I think, and with control, there's many methods to control people. But
indeed.
But there you go. So I think that ties that one up for this week.
Please remember, boys and girls, links everywhere. Let's get this show on the road. Dem bones, linking bones.
Yeah, please do that. Your Facebook, your Twitter, your Google Plus. Only takes a click. That would be a big help for us guys here, right, with our new station. I think that ties it up then. We'll look forward to the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves, and we'll be seeing you soon. Bye.
Yaki da.